for more schedule information.
And Book TV is on location in Las Vegas at the Freedom Fest Libertarian Convention. We're talking with authors here, and now we want to introduce you to one. This is Hyrum Lewis, who teaches at BYU in Idaho. And here's the cover of his book, There Is a God, How to Respond to Atheism in the Last Days. I want to start with those last words.
Sure.
In the last days. What are you referencing?
Yes, I'm referencing a specific faith tradition. Obviously, there's a lot of work in apologetics coming out. The new atheists, as you know, have gotten very aggressive in the 21st century.
Who are the new atheists?
Well, they usually talk about the four horsemen. Richard Dawkins is the most notable. Wrote a book called The God Delusion, but he has some confreres. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who's passed on, and then Daniel Dennett, a philosopher at Tufts University. So they call them the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. But they're aggressive and they're angry. The old atheism of the 20th century was much more live and let live. The idea was, I can't believe, but if you want to believe, that's your business, and it's probably good for you, and it's probably good for society. The new atheists will have none of this. They'll say, I don't believe, and I'm going to make sure nobody else believes either. And I'm going to crusade to try to destroy everybody's faith. And so part of it is kind of playing a little off that apocalypticism of the new atheists. But when I'm talking about the last days, I'm talking about the Latter-day Saint faith tradition. I'm trying to broaden the scope of apologetics. So you have, for instance, you have a Catholic tradition that goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas, in which they make a lot of philosophical arguments for the existence of God. I'm sure you're familiar with these: the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the argument from design. You've got a whole range of things that St. Thomas Aquinas did in his Summa Theologica. Then you've got a Protestant tradition which focuses on the text. You remember Martin Luther taught this idea of sola scriptura, that the Bible is the ultimate authority. So this Protestant tradition wants to go back and it wants to look at the text itself and find evidences for belief within the text, the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection, for instance. What I think, there are some traditions that are being left out of the apologetic conversation, though. For instance, Society of Friends, called Quakers, or Latter-day Saints, or even strains of congregationalism, in which we focus on direct experience with God. We focus on revelation. And when I say revelation, I don't necessarily mean a man with a long white beard going up a mountain to receive 10 commandments or to talk to a burning bush. I'm talking about something more direct and everyday. So the vast majority of people you talk to, if you say, why do you believe in God? They're probably not going to say, well, you know, I read St. Thomas Aquinas and I was convinced. You'll run across people like that, but it's not frequent. You probably won't even say, well, I read the Bible and the textual evidences were so strong. What they'll probably say is, you know, in moments of quiet contemplation, or in moments of prayer, or moments of ritual, or at a major life event like the birth of a child, I just felt the presence of the divine. Now, what the new atheists will tell you now is that, and feel free to cut me off, Peter, anytime you want. What the new atheists will tell you is these feelings don't count, that only empirical experience counts as knowledge. And if you're talking about feelings, then it simply is illegitimate. And the funny thing about this is that in and of itself is not an empirical statement. If you say only empirical, and what we mean by empirical is just knowledge that comes through the senses. If only empirical knowledge counts, then saying only empirical knowledge counts itself is self-refuting. It's like somebody going to a web page and the web page saying, don't believe anything you read on the internet. It's self-contradictory. So, and then, you know, Willard Van Orman Quine, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, he was a professor at Harvard for years and years. He actually pointed this out in an argument called The Two Dogmas of Empiricism, one of the great articles of the 20th century, and said that he started out his life as a logical empiricist who agreed with these atheists that you can't believe anything that's not sense data related. And then he later on said, you know, this is just resting on a dogma. It's resting on a faith assumption. If you believe that only empirical knowledge counts, you're taking that as an act of faith. You don't have any reason to believe it. It's just something you want to believe as a dogma. And then the second thing is if you point that out, well, then the atheist might say, well, it's a hallucination. These feelings you're having is just your brain tricking you. And they'll use evolutionary psychology and say, over the course of millions of years, your brain has evolved, not for truth, but for survival. And so feelings that there is a God had some kind of survival value way back when. But now we've gotten beyond that. Now we know better. Now we can look back and say it may have had some use thousands of years ago on the plains of Savannah, but now we can move beyond that, and now we can simply recognize this for the evolutionary trick that it is and stop believing in God. Well, this is self-defeating too, because if our brains evolved to trick us, then why should we believe the findings of science? Why aren't those a big trick? The atheist wants to invoke tricks to explain every religious experience away. But if you can say your brain is a big tricking deception machine, then why isn't it tricking us when we're doing the findings of science? Again, they don't have an answer for that either. The third thing they might say is that, well, actually, you say these feelings aren't empirical, but they are. And what they mean by this, when I say revelation, I'm talking about a lot besides just experiences of God. For instance, your experience of being a self, of being a conscious human being, that's not empirical. You don't see that under a microscope. You don't look into a microscope and say, well, gee, there's my mind. The fact that you love your wife or children, this is not an empirical experience. It's a subjective experience. So as I see it, these are revelatory experiences. They're not amenable to science. We're here at Freedom Fest. The idea that you have free will, that you're a free conscious being, that in and of itself is a revelatory knowledge. It's not something you get through science. In fact, scientists don't believe in free will by and large. They say, oh, that's an evolutionary illusion too. So the most important things in life, love, freedom, ultimate values, morality, these are not amenable to science. So what the atheist will say is, well, when you feel joy or when you feel love for your children, if I look at your brain under some kind of an imaging technology, I'll see certain parts of the brain light up with joy. Therefore, that lighting up is empirical, and therefore it is scientific. My response to that is they're falling prey to what I call the vacuum tube fallacy. If you took somebody back in the 1970s, let's say Mr. Rogers was on TV, and you brought somebody from a primitive part of the world who had never seen electricity, never seen a television before, and you showed them Mr. Rogers on the TV, then they might go to the back of the TV and look in and see that vacuum tubes were lighting up. Their conclusion would have been the vacuum tubes are causing the picture. But this is a false assumption. The program that's on the TV is being broadcast from thousands of miles away, some studio. The vacuum tubes are merely the receptors. And so that's the relationship between the brain and the mind. The brain is merely the receptor of the mind. And they're also violating the atheist art. The basic thing you learn if you go into a Statistics 101 class, the most basic thing you learn is correlation is not causation. And yet they see a correlation between a brain state and a mental state, and they say the brain state is causing the mental state. Well, this is just a bad assumption. They need to go retake Statistics 101. It's funny because we talked to Mr. Rogers, the first question he would always get from kids when he'd show up at events that he was doing is the first thing they'd say to him, these little 4-year-olds, they'd say, how'd you get out? How'd you get out of the TV? Because they were assuming, like the atheists, that you are caused by your brain. They were assuming that the TV was causing Mr. Rogers. So, the atheists need to realize that you are not your brain, your mind is not your brain, and the TV was not Mr. Rogers. The vacuum tubes are not the television program.
Professor Lewis, you spend quite a bit of time with Darwin and Origin of the Species in your book.
Sure. I think Charles Darwin was one of the greatest intellects of all time. I am a big believer in evolution. We don't like to talk about scientific facts, but evolution is as close as you can get to a scientific fact in science. So I have no problems with evolution. I think it has been a terrible thing when religious apologists tethered themselves to opposing evolution. My God is great enough that he can create however he wants. And if he wants to create through evolutionary processes, I have no problem with that. I'm thrilled with it. The same way that we understand God by looking at the movement of the planets, the workings of quarks and atomic particles, we can understand God through looking at the process by which he created. Darwinism is a little more controversial than evolution. I think evolution is well established. Whether or not variation and selection, which is the Darwinian mechanism through which scientists claim that evolution happened, whether that can account for all biological complexity is another question, and there are people who say, nah, it needs some kind of help, and they call themselves intelligent design scientists. I don't call them intelligent design scientists, but I do call them intelligent design philosophers. And I'm okay with teaching that in school as a philosophy, but I don't think it should be put in competition with Darwin, because science, as we've defined it in the 21st century, is a search for natural material causes. Once we jump out and say, and therefore God did it, it seems like we're jumping out of science itself, and I think that should be reserved for a course on theology or on philosophy. So if they wanted to have a prefatory part of the class saying, okay, we're going to talk about the theory of evolution, we'll get to all this stuff later, but is there a case to be made for an intelligent designer behind this whole process? I think that would be fine. I have no problem with it. But setting it up as a competition, as an either-or of evolution or intelligent design, I think it's a huge intellectual and strategic mistake. And it brings up, with some justification, these charges of being anti-intellectual. So I like the intelligent design theorists. I really do. I read Stephen Meyer's stuff. I like it. I see what David Berlinski has done. I think it's very interesting. It may or may not be persuasive. But I think in trying to fight the battle of Darwinism or design, to me, that's just an error.
Is Darwinism or evolution amoral as opposed to man, and is man naturally moral?
Darwinism is amoral. That's the exactly right way to put it. Some people say Darwinism is immoral. Darwin himself said this. He said, look, my theory operates on the principle of survival of the fittest. Your genes preserve themselves, and Richard Dawkins is one of the great philosophers in history who has been arguing for a preservation, that preservation happens on the gene level. And because of that, you have these selfish genes trying to replicate themselves. And therefore, he says, the selfish gene, being selfish is your natural state. No, I don't think that's true, because we've also evolved to cooperate. We have cooperative genes. And Dawkins said, I could have called my book the cooperative gene, because we both cooperate and we're selfish. So you look at every single characteristic human beings have: the capacity for love, the capacity for hate, the capacity for selfishness, the capacity for selflessness, the capacity for kindness, the capacity for cruelty, the inclination to destroy, the inclination to create. These are all natural inclinations. And you can find evidence in Darwinism, or I should say at least make up ex post stories, to explain how these traits came about. So to say, well, we can get our morals from evolution strikes me as just bizarre, because everything we do comes from evolution. So Dr. Shermer, Michael Shermer, he's the editor of Skeptic Magazine, he's written this article, which most atheists disagree with, by the way.
And he is an atheist.
Correct. He makes this argument, says we can derive an ought from an is. You can look at the way the world is, the way humans actually behave, and conclude that that's how we should behave. So he says it is the case that we humans strive to survive and flourish. Therefore, something is moral if it promotes surviving and flourishing. My answer to that is, it is the case that we humans commit genocide against one another, that we start wars, that we murder, that we rape, that we kill. To say, therefore, we should do those things is preposterous. So the way you put it is exactly right. Evolution is amoral. We have to introduce morality from outside the natural world. And that's a great argument for God. That was C.S. Lewis's main argument for God. And I have a chapter in my book called The Good Delusion. Richard Dawkins writes this book, says there's a delusion of God. I say, every argument you make, Mr. Dawkins, against the existence of God, you can make the same argument against the existence of good. He says feelings don't count. You can't believe in God because you feel God. The only way you know what's right and wrong is through feelings. It's through moral intuitions. And if I can have intuitions about what's moral, why can't I have intuitions about the creator of the universe? They never offer an answer to that. They're stuck.
Hyrum Lewis, you talk about the physicist Max Planck in your book. Why?
Well, because he was one of the inventors of quantum theory, one of the great theories of all times, and he was a practicing Christian. He was a very hardcore religious believer. There is this bizarre idea, and I can't believe anyone believes it, that there is a war between science and religion. It is simply preposterous. If you look at every great scientist throughout history, including Darwin when he created his theory of evolution, they've all been religious believers. Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, Werner Heisenberg, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, Mendel. You go through the roll call of great scientists throughout history, and every single one of them has been a religious believer. There is no war. It's ridiculous. The only time a war comes up is when you have people step outside of their boundaries, when you have religious people trying to make scientific statements, trying to turn the book of Genesis into a biology textbook, for instance. That's when we run into problems. Or when you have scientists making religious claims. So science is the realm of the empirical and repeatable. It's what you can find in a laboratory. Religion is the realm of the ultimate. Science is incapable of saying anything about ultimate matters. Religion, on the other hand, is not generally concerned with these more proximate matters. So I use Max Planck as an example of a practicing Christian that just belies this ridiculous idea that there's a war between science and religion. So there's these books written by atheists. They say, along came science and it displaced religion in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. This is just preposterous. Religion didn't go anywhere. They just don't know their history. They say, look, the founding fathers were Enlightenment men of science, not men of religion. Why is it an either or? You just see these preposterous either ors being trumpeted about in our current society, these ridiculous false binaries. One of them is, I get this all the time, are you left or are you right? Neither, and both. There is plenty to agree with on the left, there's plenty to agree with on the right. Why do we have to stuff everything in these false categories? Something that people here at Freedom Fest will agree with me on. People say there's this binary. Do you believe in capitalism or do you want to help the poor? It's a false binary. The societies that have the most help for the poor and the most well-being for the poor are the most capitalist. Unfortunately, the atheists have bought into a false binary too. Do you believe in science or do you believe in religion? And the history of science shows that that is just a ridiculous formulation. Indeed, America, most people don't know this, America has gotten more religious as it's gotten more scientific. John Butler at Yale, Sidney Alstrom, his buddy there, Edwin Gustad, all the great historians of religion, of American religion, have shown that as science has increased in America, religion has increased right along with it. Now we're in a little bit of a dip right now. The past 20 years or so, we've seen a decline in religiosity and the rise of the unreligious. But this is just a brief moment. The long arc of American history has been upward.
Why do you think that is?
A couple reasons. One, I think 9/11 did something to a lot of people. I think that's what made the new atheists emboldened. They saw Islamic terrorists perpetrating these attacks and they said, religion causes violence. And so they started writing all these books like Christopher Hitchens saying, God is not great. So a lot of people bought into their arguments. And a lot of people said, yeah, religion caused violence on 9/11. Religion is bad. It's that association. This is bad reasoning. This is what, and they should know better as scientists, right? These atheists claim the mantle of science, and yet they become exceedingly unscientific when it comes to religion. If I were to say to you, Democrats are bad because I knew one bad Democrat, or if I was to say to you, smoking doesn't kill people because my father-in-law smoked and he lived to be 90, you'd say that's ridiculous. That's what we call anecdotal evidence. It's not data. And yet when it comes to the value of religion, these atheists rely entirely on anecdotal evidence. Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, is all just telling stories about, look at what this religious person did that's bad. Look at this pedophile Catholic priest. What they never want to do is engage scientific evidence. Because if you go to the scientific evidence, it is devastating to their case. Every time you have actual scientific polls or social scientists controlling for other variables in Western societies, where we have freedom of religion, the religious score higher on every agreed upon measure of morality and well-being that you can imagine. I mean, study after study, there are literally thousands of them showing that religious people live longer. Religious people give more to charity. Religious people are more educated, believe it or not, than less religious people. That religious people adopt more children. That there's higher social capital among the religious. That the crime rate is lower. Just go down the list of things we are trying to promote in society that we can agree, Democrats, Republicans, everybody, that would be good. And you find those things are the good things in society are better because of religion. And that religious believers are really, in a quite literal sense, in Jesus' sense, the salt of the earth. They're making our societies better. And so for these new atheists to be out there trying to destroy religion is immoral by their own criterion. Michael Shermer says again and again, something is immoral if it hurts human flourishing. Something is moral if it promotes human flourishing. Well, guess what promotes human flourishing? Religion does. Religious belief makes society better. It reduces crime, it increases social capital, it reduces depression, it increases economic well-being, and yet he's out there trying to destroy it. He's trying to destroy flourishing. He's doing something immoral by his own terms. Now, I like Michael Shermer. I like Skeptic Magazine. I like his debunking of UFOs. I like his debunking of Holocaust denial. I like all that stuff. But when he's going after religion, he's doing something that's immoral, even by his own criterion.
Mao and Stalin.
Yeah, great examples. If you want to go anecdotal, there's the anecdotes to go to. So prior to the 20th century, you have atheists all the time. When they want to tell their anecdotes, when they want to tell their stories, they want to go to the Middle Ages. They want to talk about the Inquisition. They want to talk about religious wars. They want to talk about witch hunts and the Salem witch hunts. And they say, look at all these bad things religious people were doing. Clearly religion is bad. Well, that doesn't even rise to the level of anecdotal evidence because there's no control group. If a racist came up to you and said, you know what, black people are inherently more violent than white people, you'd say, okay, what's your evidence? They'd say, well, before the year 1500 in Africa, black people committed all the crime. They committed all the oppression, all of the assaults, all of the rapes, all of the thefts, all done by black people. I don't see white people committing those crimes. Your obvious answer would be, there were no white people. It's a silly thing to say, there's no control group. And that's exactly what the atheists do. They say, look at all the terrible things religious believers were doing in the Middle Ages. Look at all the terrible things that religious people were doing with their religious wars and so forth. I don't see atheists doing that stuff. The answer is, there were no atheists. It's a silly thing to say, so take that all and throw it into the garbage. We don't have a control group until the 20th century. It's not until the 20th century when there are sufficient numbers of atheists, and there are specifically openly atheistic regimes, when we can actually say something meaningful about atheists. And once you do that, if you want to compare the atheist violence and religious believer violence, the atheists win in a landslide. The biggest mass murder of all times was Chairman Mao. He's an atheist. Stalin, probably the second greatest mass murderer of all time, also an atheist. Pol Pot, per capita, probably the greatest murderer of all times. He's an atheist, and they're leading atheistic regimes and doing so in the name of a materialist ideology, an atheist materialism. So this idea that religious causes violence, if you want to play the anecdote game, the atheists will lose that one too. Of course, I don't like to do the anecdotes. I like to look at social scientific data, which shows that atheists are worse off. But if you want to look at somebody like Chairman Mao, what Richard Dawkins does, he tries to wiggle his way out of this. He tries to say, well, they're not really atheists. Oh, really? They said they were atheists? No, they weren't really atheists because Mao believed in a Marxist ideology, which was a kind of religion, see? But here the atheists trying to have it both ways. You hear atheists say all the time that atheism is not a religion. So I even get people coming up to me sometimes and I have to correct them. They say, you know what, you're right, Dr. Lewis. You say that everybody has faith. The atheists have faith. Their faith is just in atheism. I say, you're wrong. Atheism is not a faith. Atheism is simply a non-belief in God. So Michael Shermer says all the time, atheism is a non-belief in God, full stop. It's not a religion. I don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster. Full stop. I just don't think there's evidence for a flying spaghetti monster. I don't believe in it. That's not a religion. I'm not a high priest in the flying spaghetti monster religion. So atheism itself is not a religion. So if you say, well, Stalin wasn't really an atheist because he was a communist, wrong. You just said that atheism is a non-belief in God, full stop. Stalin didn't believe in God, full stop. He's an atheist. Mao didn't believe in God, full stop. He's an atheist. Pol Pot did not believe in God, full stop. He's an atheist. All of these terrible tyrants of the 20th century were atheists by the atheist's very own definition, and they can't wriggle out of it. So when you want to look at the consequences of religious belief and the consequences of atheism and compare it, the atheists, the wickedness done by atheists is just overwhelming. It doesn't mean atheists are bad people. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying anything about any one atheist. Dr. Shermer is a good guy. Richard Dawkins, as far as I know, is probably compassionate and gives money to charitable causes. I mean, as far as I know, they can be good people. We're simply talking on average. We're talking in the broad scope of history here.
Throughout your book, There Is a God, you address the LDS Church. What is that, and are you a member?
Yes, I am. Good question. I appreciate the use of the word LDS. As you know, the church has recently tried to get people to not use the colloquial term Mormon. That people
Where did that term come from, by the way?
Well, because we have a sacred book of Scripture called the Book of Mormon. So people took the name of that book, applied it to us as an epithet, and so then the name kind of stuck. But the Book of Mormon itself says that, look, this is the Church of Jesus Christ. It's not the church of a prophet. And if you're calling the church by the name of a prophet, then you're calling it the wrong thing. Mormon was a prophet who was the redactor of the Book of Mormon. So it's a mistake to call our church the Mormon Church. It's slightly insulting because it goes against our religious precepts. Now, why is the church at this moment pushing us to talk about Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, full name of the church? I think it's because we live in a moment in world history, and certainly in American history, when things have gotten too soundbitey. We are too much in love with the short soundbite. And instead of fleshing things out, we need more and more to stop. You just see it all the time in cable news and so forth. People are shouting at each other, left wing, right wing, fascist, commie. Instead of sitting down and saying, tell me what you believe, and giving longer answers. Calling the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, forces that. It forces us to say, okay, I'm not going to use a soundbite. I'm going to explain. Jesus Christ, that's the name of your church. We worship Jesus Christ. We consider him our Lord and Savior. Latter-day Saints, what does that mean? It means that we believe in a last days and a restoration of the pure truth that Jesus taught during his lifetime, which is something, incidentally, that Thomas Jefferson, Roger Williams, and other great defenders of religious freedom have championed, this idea of a restoration of religious truth. So my book was written to make an apologetic case for there is a God. It's written to try to include more religious traditions within this apologetic conversation, and the LDS, Latter-day Saint religious tradition, is the one it's primarily aimed at. But I think religious believers of all stripes, or people who are doubting the existence of God, whatever their faith tradition, I think they can profit from it because the arguments are not exclusive to Latter-day Saints.
What and where do you teach, and how did you get interested in this?
Oh, great question. I teach at BYU Idaho. It's a smaller school. It's an affiliate of the BYU school in Provo. It's a sister campus.
Brigham Young.
Yeah, Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, which is the one people know because of the football team that was good once upon a time. I teach there. It's just south of Yellowstone National Park. It's in one of the most beautiful spots in the country. I shouldn't say this because I'm trying to keep it small, and people are moving there, and I don't want them to because we like how it is. We like the small town and the small size. So I've had visiting positions at Stanford University, Skidmore College, but now I'm at BYU Idaho, and I just love it there. How did I get into apologetics? I should say by digression. I didn't mean to make this a major part of my study. I'm an intellectual historian by training, and during graduate school, if you're reading intellectual history, you're reading the atheists because they dominate the conversation. You're reading John Dewey, you're reading Karl Marx, you're reading Sigmund Freud, you're reading the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School. You're reading atheistic thinkers nonstop. They were the big guns. And so what I would do is, as I'm reading and as I'm discussing in seminar these kinds of things, it was like an itch I had to scratch. Ernest Hemingway once said that you write because it's like an exorcism. You've got these demons in your head that you have to get rid of. And I found that was true. I couldn't move on until I had written things down. And so I'd have these ideas, these refutations of what I thought were the bad arguments of the new atheists. And I would write them down, and I just kind of kept a file. And eventually, I started saying, well, I wonder if I could organize this into something bigger. And so over the course of a few months, I just kind of started putting things around, and my brother said, you ought to turn that into a book. And so I did the polishing, the rewriting, which is, of course, the most important part of the writing process. Got it in book form. I had a friend at Cedar Fort, and they published it for me, and there it is. So this isn't my métier. What I teach at Brigham Young University, Idaho, is U.S. history. I teach the American founding. I teach a course on American civics. I teach a course on film history. I've taught Asian history in the past. In a smaller department, you get a wider variety of topics to teach, which is kind of fun. But don't teach religious matters. So this is a side thing for me, but it was something that was important enough to me, and important enough to me in my own spiritual development, and the conclusions I came to. I thought they could be helpful for other people too. So that's why I wrote them down.
What's an apologetic?
Apologetics is a term that comes out of the Middle Ages. It sounds worse than it is. Apologetics, it sounds like you're apologizing for something. That's the English word, but it derives from Latin, or our ancient languages anyway. But apologetics today means I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So you say apologetics, it's as if you're apologizing for your faith. I'm sorry, I believe. Let me explain to you, I'm just so sorry. Apologetics simply means defense of the faith. So when we talk about apologetics for Christianity, we're talking about people who speak out in favor of Christianity, in favor of Christian religion, in favor of beliefs in God, against those people who would attack it. And since the attacks on religion has gotten so much more pronounced here in the 21st century, we need solid apologetics to answer those attacks, because they're not very good attacks. But it's just, we don't have people standing up to them. The tone of my book I'm not proud of. It is a little bit hostile. Maybe you noticed as you read it. It can get a little bit chippy sometimes. That's unintentional. As a Christian, that's something I need to work on. That's not the Christ-like way. But the atheists behave like intellectual bullies. Richard Dawkins said that my faith is, quote, frankly bonkers. This is insulting. He's a bully. He's rude. He's arrogant. And if I respond in kind sometimes, I don't think it's the right thing to do, but perhaps my readers can forgive a little bit. Perhaps it's understandable that I respond with a little bit of a strong tone at times, because the atheists are so aggressive and so bullying and so rude. Maybe there's a place to stand up to the bullies, even if they're intellectual ones.
Hyrum Lewis is the author of this book, There Is a God: How to Respond to Atheism in the Last Days. Thanks for your time.
Great to be with you, Peter. Thank you.
You're watching Book TV on